I'm host. I'll just quickly introduce you. First, I want to thank Jeff for being the ringleader, and it's been a good thing this year. So our speaker today is Michelle Clarke at Dartmouth College. Michelle has worked mostly on Machiavelli, including a book, Machiavelli's Florentine Republic, a number of articles. She's also dipped into, more than dipped into Roman thought, particularly how it's received or misreceived in the Renaissance and in contemporary times. Some work on the sort of what's called the methodology of textual interpretation, particularly Skinner. So this paper is sort of in her wheelhouse today on Mandragola. So welcome to Michelle Clarke. Take it away.
All right, yes, big thank you for inviting me. I have to say the invitation, I was grateful to receive it initially, but I'm really happy, extra happy to be here now because I was explaining to John last night, I just got reader reports back on this from a journal. And so this is, I'm gearing up to make revisions to the paper, and this is a really, really perfect time to gather feedback. And I'll say some things in a moment about what those readers reports have said, just to maybe more actively solicit, like targeted advice about how to go about making those revisions. I'd be really, really grateful for guidance. I have some ideas about how I would approach it. But so this paper originated in a talk that I gave in 2018 at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, at a symposium that was celebrating the 500th anniversary. It's one of these spates of conferences on 500th anniversary conferences, but this on specifically on Mandragola. And I've written a bunch on Machiavelli, but I've always sort of avoided Mandragola because have always found it to be a little mysterious. It's very interesting, and the work on it I find fascinating, but I've never really known what I think about it necessarily. And yet I wanted to attend this symposium. So I buckled down and wrote a talk that was actually not on this subject, but on allusions to the rape of the Sabine women in the play, and looking at how there are effectively sort of two dimension, or, there are two rapes, so to speak, Roman rapes that are being alluded to in the play, and what the interrelationship between those references is. And I got to a point in that I was writing it up as a chapter in a book that I was at that time working on, which has itself changed quite a bit. And I just found myself really kind of not able to get to the bottom of the central theme, which was the way in which Machiavelli takes the subject of marriage and uses it to kind of explore the theme of concordia, which is how it's used in Machiavelli's retelling of the rape of the Sabine women. That becomes a story for Livy about how Roman political life becomes civilized and domesticated and transformed into an arena in which there's the possibility of compromise and discussion as a way of settling disagreements. And anyway, I reached a point in that talk where I just felt like the subject of love and marriage in Machiavelli was something that I didn't fully understand, especially as he was engaging with what seemed to me at that point a much wider range of sources beyond Livy. And this is all a long way of saying that I ended up finding myself in the middle of a paper that was suddenly about Lucretius and Ovid. Lucretius and Ovid being two writers who I was much less familiar with. But the more digging I did into those source materials, the more I saw how rich the veins of theoretical influence were. And so the paper has done a real 180 over the course of those 3 years. And I might go back to the original subject of the talk and finish writing that up at some point. There's a lot of good stuff there too. But where I've ended up, this is a paper that I really enjoyed writing and I like a lot. And yet one that I've sort of struggled with finding an outlet for at this point. So as I said, I was originally writing it as a chapter, originally it was a talk, and then it became a chapter for a book. The subject matter of the book has changed such that it no longer has a place for this paper. And so now the paper just needs to find a home in a journal somewhere. And it's been desk rejected. I was telling John, it's been desk rejected like 3 times. And, it's going down as one does through the list of places one can send papers to. And at a certain point, I sort of rage submitted it to political theory. Like I jumped back up the rankings just because I was offended that, I really like this paper and nobody was even sending it out for review. And I just thought I was angry about that. I took offense. And so I sent it to political theory thinking I never write anything really that I see as, political theory as being an appropriate outlet for. I'm so conventional in my interests and so conventional in how I write and read and so forth. And I think I'm just like too old school for political theory generally. But I was like, erotic artistry or, erotic illusion. That sounds like maybe political theory would go for that. And maybe like 5% chance. So I did send it there. And then I ended up getting an R&R last week. And the reports basically say that while they find the argument compelling, I think they're very positive with regard to the actual argument I'm trying to make. They just don't think it's political theory. And so they think it's a great argument, but just not something that should come out in this particular journal. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with politics. And the editors agree with that, but they like it enough that they're willing to give me a chance to explain what is political theory, what is political theoretical about this interpretation of Mandragola that I've worked up. And also how it can be informative with respect to how we read the Prince and the Discourses. So I have ideas about how I might do that, but I imagine you have more and better ideas than I do, and I'm really, my ears are open for them. But I do also want to put out there that I need to find space for whatever revisions I make. The text word count limit for political theory is 8,000 words, and my submission was 7,999. So, and what you're reading is like 8,400 because I had to add a couple back just because I really just thought at a certain point it doesn't make sense. So I added some footnotes too back to, secondary literature that's useful to know something about. So, so I need to make some radical revisions here. There needs to be a lot that's cut, and I think it needs to be reorganized, and there needs to be the insertion of some discussion of both the Machiavelli's corpus and sort of broader themes in political theory. So anyway, so that avoids the contents of the paper entirely, assuming you've read it, but maybe gives you a sense of where I'm coming from and where I'm going with it.
Good. Thanks. So open up for Q&A. I suppose you could either raise your hand or put something in the chat and I'll call on you.
Could I say before we start, I should have opened with this point too. It's just a really basic Zoom point. I'm in northern Vermont, and my Wi-Fi is reliable, but the internet feed to my Wi-Fi is not. And so there have been times when I've experienced very unstable connections and had to restart. So I just apologize in advance if that happens. But if you see me disappear, that I'm coming back.
Bob has a question. Bob Faulkner, you're on mute.
Hi. It's a wonderful subject, the Mandragola. So I had questions about just how political your interpretation was myself. And I had not thought to speak, but since your editors have raised such a difficulty, I will.
Yeah.
I'll put my view bluntly. This play shows a kind of liberation, a liberation of sexual desire in particular. But it also shows management. It shows the two sides, or I won't say the two sides, but two sides of Machiavelli's politics. And you don't talk of Ligurio, and you almost draw the connection with liberation by the comparisons with Ovid and in particular Lucretius. That's very interesting. But it's very interesting politically because it shows, can I put it this way? The private side, the private liberation that comes with Machiavelli's plan. And as for the management side, you don't say a thing about Ligurio. But Ligurio is an ingenious broker of passions. And that to some extent, again, reflects on Machiavellian management. So here I've not asked you a question. Instead, I've blah-blahed certain remarks of my own. But it seems to me you're on the verge of saying really interesting things politically, but you tend to retreat to an account of the sources. Without drawing that out. I've suggested two kinds of political implication that enough.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it reads like a reception paper. It is a reception paper as it currently stands, more or less. I think it's a little bit more than just that, but that's primarily what it is at this point. But not really what I want it to ultimately be. So I appreciate the pressure and guidance. The reason why it's the reception paper that it is right now is because in addition to the sort of play-by-play that I gave a moment ago about the how the kind of paper came about, I've also just had a lingering dissatisfaction with the literature on Machiavelli's reception of Lucretius. So there's been work done on that, or work about that is suggestive, and I think points the way to some really important connections, but hasn't really located the kind of evidence that I would want to see to feel that the echoes that are being discerned in, for example, the discourses of Lucretius are really echoes of Lucretius, as opposed to, lots of people were reading Lucretius and talking about Lucretius, and, there's a game of telephone being played within Renaissance Florence, and it's very easy to mistake the kind of absorption of ideas that are in circulation and are being reinterpreted and reconceived as they're being transmitted around, as being evidence that he understands himself to be drawing on and responding to Lucretius directly, right? So I want to find a smoking gun. And so a lot of this was just driven by my desire to show textual connections between De Rerum Natura and something that Machiavelli himself wrote, right? More fine-grained, linguistic points of contact. And it's for that reason that I'm like as sort of, dare I say, laborious in my, like pointing one after another where I see them. I really want there to be something out there that does the work of showing that there's, that Machiavelli didn't just transcribe Lucretius and then even just bear a kind of like diffuse impression of what that text contained, but he really remembered it in detail, and that there's a kind of care and sensitivity and nuance to the response he's making. And so, so the paper has that character now, but I think having done that, I can see a bit more clearly what the broader conceptual debates between them are, which I point to, but sort of on the margins of that analysis. And, you know, it is the case that I focus mostly on Lucrezia in the paper. That's just a choice that I made, and it does crowd out my ability to analyze other figures, but I don't think, and it crowds out my ability to say anything at any real length about Ligurio. I don't know if I even refer to him at all in the paper, which is, you know, kind of scandalous, but I think it is what it is. And I don't think Ligurio is the only political character in the play. And I think, you know, there is the story that I tell about Lucrezia's own transformation as one that has a political character to it. There's a kind of political education that she's receiving and that allows her to come into the position of political leadership that she occupies at the end, I argue. And it is one that it's marked by, as you say, Robert, it's marked by a kind of liberation, balanced by a kind of management. It's an education that brings Lucrezia into a position where she can capably be and do both. And it's in that respect, you know, so thematically I focus on virtue as being the kind of concept of choice that I'm going to delve into, and the kind of virtue that Lucrezia demonstrates at the end of the play, I think is very similar to Machiavelli's description of princely virtue. I'm not the first person to make this connection, but the kind of princely virtue that he describes in The Prince, although the difference between what others have said and what I would say is that the Ovidian point about virtue being the ability to manipulate erotic appearances, I think that's very fruitfully read back into The Prince as something that a prince has to be able to do, right? The idea that what princes do is satisfy desires, I think is you know, the language of desire satisfaction is quite, is very foregrounded in The Prince, but I think it would be very difficult to argue that Machiavelli's view of what princes do is satisfy desires. What princes do is make people feel their desires are being satisfied. And it can only ever be the seeming of desire satisfaction, because like Lucrezia's households, the polity is always encompasses different groups with not only divergent interests, but directly contradictory interests. And in order to maintain any level of stability or harmony within the polity, right, a prince needs to effectively persuade his constituents that they're getting what they want, even as, in fact, what they want is being compromised for the sake of being able to effectively persuade other people that they're also getting what they want. And he has things, of course, to say about whose desires are more, it's easier to more fully satisfy the desires of the people, for example, right? He has things to say about that. But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think that they're getting entirely what they want either. So anyway, long answer, but so I think there, but in that sense, I think there's a political story to be told about Lucrezia and what she represents in the play, as well as Ligurio, but probably another great paper about him too, to be written, not by me.
I don't want to appear in disguise, so.
No, there you are.
Let you at least see my image. I'll close my comments just by saying, to focus as you do upon the sources,
yeah,
makes this an article, especially for a history of ideas journal.
Yeah.
Whereas you have a very interesting political tale to tell about Lucretia.
Yeah.
And forget Ligurio, except if you want to mention him, fine. But what you say about Lucretia is extremely interesting.
Mm.
That should be the theme of your article, perhaps. Right from the start, remarking upon the transformation of Lucretia and the significance of that, and how it contrasts with other portraits of I say Lucretia, with other portraits of Lucretia. But the remarks on sources ought to be subordinated to that political account if you're looking to revise the article for a political journal.
Thanks.
Okay, we have several more questions. Let me just quickly add, though, that one of the things that you could do, for example, with Ligurio, is he transforms the desires of the characters, including of Calimico. So he just wants to, you know, just sleep with Lucretia, and he transforms this into a more durable form of love for her. And so that's one angle I think one might do. Next person has a question is Rebecca.
Thank you. I don't know if I have anything that will help you shoehorn this into political theory, except to say curses to all those who desk rejected it, because it's a wonderful paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And it sounds like what they want you to do is write a fundamentally different paper. So take this article, send it somewhere else, and give them the paper that they want. But as you know, as I was reading, I kept coming back to another character, not to keep mentioning all the characters you don't mention, you aren't able to mention in this wonderful paper, Timoteo, and in 5:1, when he talks about the images of Mary, and that was a part that I've never really been able to make sense of. And so, similar to you, I just avoid the Mandragola because it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But as I reread that this morning, it seemed like a fruitful connection could be made to images. There he talks about the icon of Mary, and that whenever the icon isn't kept in good shape, that devotion falls off, and that when she's not kept polished, then the pilgrims don't come to pay reverence. And so I don't have anything profound to say, except that there was another element of imagery that I was reminded of. But with Timoteo and Nicaea, both, you have two people who are ostensibly leaders. Nicaea is a judge, so he holds a traditional political position. And of course, Timoteo as a cleric has a different kind of a leadership position. And so I don't know if that's a way that you could satisfy the editors and the reviewers by bringing them in, especially when Nicaea, when he talks about in 2 about his role as a judge, and he just makes it sound just incredibly boring and terrible, or he just says, all I do is just sit on the bench and we hear stories of marriage is one of the things that he talks about, just sort of being the humdrum everyday part of his job as a judge. And so that's something that has always struck me as, the play is about marriage, but very much not about the humdrum, but about more of the salacious aspects of it. So I'm not sure if there's fruit there that you can tie into the broader themes about, the subversion of, just sort of different expectations about gender and politics. But yeah, I really enjoyed the paper.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and I'm happy to just have a conversation without necessarily Q&A. Right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have anything to offer right now.
I mean, some structure, I guess, is necessary, but yeah. So, so I think I don't remember if I added it back in. I did at one point in a draft of this have a reference to that comment by Timoteo at the beginning of 5 about the images, and I have cut and added so many times that I don't recall if the version that I circulated to you guys had it in there. But
if you
at one
had,
point, I missed it. I did make the point that at the beginning of 5, it's Timoteo bewailing that, or bemoaning that, that these images are no longer as effective as they had once been because the brothers are neglecting them. And I'm not quite sure what that even literally means, but by the end of it, we see Lucrezia very capably tending all these images of her and of the various relationships that she's in. And so that seems to me a very intentional kind of contrast that's being drawn, which points to another element of this, which I think is really interesting, which is the gendered character of the portrait being drawn of what I've just a moment ago described as sort of a princely virtue, right? And so it's not, so you could spell this out in different ways, and I haven't entirely thought it through, but right, so obviously Lucrezia's a woman, but she's a womanly woman insofar as we take seriously these connections with Ovid, because the style of virtue that she comes into is this style of sort of erotic virtue that Ovid associates particularly with women in Ars Amatoria. So the first 2 books of Ars Amatoria are written for men who want to seduce women, telling them all about where to go to find women, and then how to talk to them, and then how to manage them so that they remain under your control as much as you can ever hope a woman will. And then the 3rd book is directed toward women, and there the advice is different. I mean, he has a separate book because he believes that women need to do different things, right? And handle themselves differently. And the stress there really is on self-presentation and the various ways in which women have to very carefully and artfully negotiate their self-presentation with respect to men. They can't simply be themselves. They always need to be fashioning themselves in a way that offers continual stimulation to the male erotic appetite. And that means, and he has endless examples of how you do this. And it's that I think Lucrezia manages to do so skillfully by the end. And it's different than and it's, if you compare this to interpretations of Mandragola that only stress the allusion to Lucretia, the Roman Lucretia, parentheses. I don't think those interpretations are wrong, right? Those allusions are definitely there. And in no way am I trying to dislodge that kind of vein of interpretation, but he's playing with the different Lucretia's, Lucretius's. But Lucretia in Livy is a Roman matron who becomes a man, right? That's her transformation in that story. And it's very, very pointed. If you read the original, Livy is very, emphatic about how Lucretia, this paragon of womanly virtue, in and through her violation and the failure of her male associates to effectively respond to her violation, she must herself become a man. And she does, right? And she acquires all these masculine traits, and it's part of the whole, you know, Livy does this a lot, where he, as a way of showing that the essential elements of political order have been upset, he shows that there are all these inversions of a kind of natural order that are happening. And so, you know, Lucretia is forced to occupy a role that is alien to her nature and is a kind of perversity, right? And it's easy then to read Mandragola as showing something similar, that Lucrezia is coming to occupy, especially the kind of rooster/cock reference at the end, right, can be read as suggesting that she's becoming a more masculine figure herself, and the bossiness and everything, right? But there is also, you know, these very powerful ways that might be somewhat invisible unless you're reading him alongside Ovid, ways in which the persona she comes into at the end is decidedly feminine. And again, you know, to think about that in really, I mean, not just Ovid too, but insofar as he's presenting Lucrezia as a kind of reformed or revised Epicurean, right? Epicureanism itself was styled a very feminine philosophy. It was a womanly philosophy, right? In part because Epicurean circles admitted women, and in part because the idea that we should all be living lives of pleasure was seen, as opposed to duty, was seen as being a kind of capitulation to womanly corruption by anti-Epicureans. And so there are all kinds of, there are different ways in which the Epicurean and pseudo-Epicurean backgrounds of the play are helping us to see Lucrezia as being a real woman at the end. And then maybe helps us to see how Machiavelli's own appropriation of Roman virtue, which is often characterized as the appropriation of a very masculine understanding of virtue, right, in the Prince and so forth, right, the virtu, is being complicated. But not just in Mandragola, you can see it already in ways that other people have remarked in the Prince, that the Prince's virtue is some kind of combination of the kind of manly, aggressive virtue, old-fashioned virtue of the Romans, sort of conventional Romans, but combined with the more duplicitous, flexible, and in some sense, you know, the idea that women don't have a center to them. They're all appearance. They're all exterior. Like there's that idea is brought into play really powerfully in the Prince too, and I think is representative of kind of female side. So lots of thoughts in your question, lots of thoughts in my answer, but hopefully they add up to something like a rejoinder.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're on mute, John.
Next question is from Anna or Anna Marisa. I'm sorry, I don't.
Thank you. I had a question about the conclusion in the paper that Machiavelli is not really concerned about the corrupting influence of images and fantasies in the way that Lucretius is. Mm-hmm. And sort of, I think that's one of the ways in which you may be able to sort of explore the political dimension of this paper, right? Because like, what is the place of sort of images, fantasies, you know, false beliefs in politics too. Mm-hmm. And so in the paper, you mostly describe Lucretius' fear of sort of illusions and false beliefs in the context of his discussion of why sexual pleasure is sort of a type of pleasure that's incompatible with the kind of life that he thinks people should live, right? And so I thought that discussion was really interesting. And I guess I should preface this by saying that I had not read Lucretius in the past, and I'm not very familiar with Epicureanism. But so I thought this discussion was really interesting, but part of me was like, there is a more cynical reading of this very scene in Lucretius, which is this is just a man who is really, really uncomfortable with his own sexuality, and he comes up with this big philosophical theory to sort of defend this, right? So I guess my question is why you think that Lucretius' aversion to sort of sexual pleasure, and then more importantly, his aversion to the way that sexuality involves these desires and projections and fantasies, why that fear is representative of a general fear that Lucretius has of the corrupting influence of images. And then more importantly, why Machiavelli's reevaluation of sort of erotic pleasure also implies that Machiavelli, accepts the use of images and beliefs as something positive. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's very tempting to give a kind of biographical account for Lucretius, because there's this story from Jerome, I think, that he died after drinking a love potion because he was so insane with romantic.
It also sounds like he may have gotten his heart broken really badly once.
Right. So he had his heart broken really badly and had consumed some kind of love potion that was meant to cure him of this affliction, which he just otherwise couldn't rid himself of. And it killed him. That's the story. But I mean, the reason why I take it to be his thoughts about sex and sexual love as being emblematic of his views about false beliefs and fantasy generally is because he makes them emblematic. So in book 4, one of the main subject areas of book 4 is the exploration of simulacra and how, like, what appearances are, where they come from, how they are taken up by perceiving bodies and used as the material through which we know the world, whether or not that presents insurmountable problems for, knowledge and other things. And he uses various examples of appearance as being a kind of phenomena in and of itself, but it's the love and the sex that dominate the book. And it's there that he comes into the anxiety that he thinks we all should have about finding ourselves solely in the grips of a world accessible to us primarily through perception or through appearance. And this is a major problem as an Epicurean, right, who lives by the mantra that all we know is what we can perceive, right? Like the problems of perception are enormous. But he's committed to a philosophical program that'll get us beyond those limitations. And he thinks it's possible in and through the exercise of reason, but only if we do our part in regulating our own willing participation in activities and relationships that are only fundamentally about illusion and fantasy, right? And he thinks that sexual love is illusion and fantasy all the way down for the reasons I give in the paper. And so especially problematic.
I think at that point was, this might just be, again, because I was not terribly familiar with the background literature, but I feel like if that point was more clear, how that just becomes a representative illustration of this bigger point about, you know, our responsibility to control imagery. To me, that seems one of the most fascinating sort of insights then, that could have like a bigger implication for, you know, the political aspects of the argument.
Yeah, it's so complicated though, right? Because of course the whole poem is driven by Lucretius's own willingness and very skillful ability at like manipulating images, right? He uses images throughout the whole thing. He uses analogies, and they're analogies that are illustrative and helpful to some extent, but they're only analogies and they have real limitations, and they always, wherever they're in use, invite misunderstanding and error. And you know, it's a wonderful poem. I highly encourage, you know, if you're looking for, you know, beach reading this summer, and go for it. But you'll see that again and again and again, every single line, he refers us not just to examples, but then to analogies, metaphors, you know, all kinds of literary devices that play on the seemingness of things, or the semblance of things. So it's very, you know, there's no, yeah, I take your point. I'm not, yeah, I take your point exactly. I'm just complaining also about how difficult it is to make any kind of declarative statement about Lucretius, because he's so often taking with one hand what he gives with the other. I've done my best in the paper to kind of step around some of the more complicated bits, but yeah, they're there for sure.
Chris Kelly has a question.
Yeah, I thought my remark might be helpful for you framing this in a way to make it more political, but I realized that it then demands that you write a different paper. And so I'm just interested in
just in case I end up doing that, let me know what it is.
I'm interested in
a real possibility here. Yeah.
I'm interested in saying this because it's something I've been thinking about. I've been teaching Montesquieu recently, The Spirit of the Laws. And he has a discussion of different types of love literature as corresponding to different types of political situations, in which a part of his discussion is very much like the distinction you make between Lucretius' attempt to get us away from images to our senses, and then Ovid's attempt to bring back the images. And so his Montesquieu's characterization is to take Roman love literature of the late Republican, early Empire period as an attempt to reduce it all to the senses. He takes Hellenistic Greek romantic literature, you know, which is completely unpolitical because they're under the Roman Empire and they have no political life, as being simply concerned with love. It's just two people love each other. It's not the senses, it's not anything else. And then he talks about the origins of European chivalric literature in Tacitus's German tribes' concern for honor. And his discussion of this is two things. One is it's very much about images, about love potions, magic herbs, and being centered on the importance of women's opinion of men, because women are good judges of the merit of men, and merit of men is the important thing for these Germanic honor-loving people. So it seemed to me that first of all, Ovid, as you describe him, fits uneasily in this. Ovid certainly is someone who's all in favor of sensual pleasure. So one doesn't have to contrast him with Lucretius, one could ally him with that. But on the other hand, the emphasis upon images in Ovid is like what Montesquieu says about the origins of the chivalric literature, which is very much concerned with images. But it also does seem as if Montesquieu is suggesting this literature that's concerned very much with winning the woman's opinion is the really political love literature. Because when the Romans have expanded their empire, politics sort of disappears from the picture. They've conquered the world. What else is there to do? And the Hellenics, they have no political life because they're among the conquered people. They can just think about purely private matters, love between two people. But the political situation, and I will mention this whole discussion is in a chapter with the title on mores relative to combat. It's all about war, duels, trial by combat, and so on. This is where he launches into his discussion of love literature. And it did seem to me that the connection between an empowerment of women's opinion and a concern with somewhat fantastic images in a way unites Machiavelli's treatment with a political situation that Montesquieu describes. So I'd be interested in having your thoughts about this. I mean, it seems to me that it's somehow connected with the Ovid question, because he doesn't mention Ovid by name, but he's clearly referring to him and other writers like him.
Yeah, I don't have a well-formed answer, but here's some thoughts. First of all, it just is always revealing what it can be found in Montesquieu that, Spirit of Law is such a big book. It has everything in it. If you just look hard enough, like it's just a commentary on everything. I wasn't aware of commentary on romantic literature though. So that would be interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like he's interested, like the chivalric model would be political in that it doesn't rely on, the senses. The other two are about the senses and about love. So about just sort of physical attraction as a basis for male-female relationships. Love being maybe a kind of also, in a sense, spontaneous, sentimental connection. But the third being something that's much more negotiated and a product of, as you say, like judgment interacting with opinion, and something that happens iteratively and has a kind of complexity and open-endedness to it that brings it into the world of politics. That these are two parties that maybe have no, I don't know how I would work it out exactly, but what is it? That there's some kind of, I use the word negotiation, but how do we, it's like they're two rivals who are positioning themselves relative to one another and figuring out if there's a way that they can productively interact as opposed to simply fight, which is maybe kind of why it's in a book or, in a chapter that is entitled, whatever you said it was, something combat. And that does put it in contact with Ovid insofar as Ovid is always and everywhere figuring love as war by other means, or war undertaken in another arena, in which men and women are struggling for position relative to one another. And I think for him, I don't know if I have final thoughts about this. I think it seems to me that Ovid is a little less clear than Montesquieu is, at least, or as Montesquieu thinks chivalric literature is, on just who is judging whom and what that dynamic looks like. It's a little bit more complicated maybe than just men attempting to win the approval of women as though women have some settled set of expectations or views. But yeah, I mean, that's a common theme for Ovid, and to bring it into Machiavelli or into the realm of a discussion to be had about Machiavelli's own views about politics. You know, what's interesting and valuable to me, one of maybe, I guess, several things about the connection between Machiavelli and Ovid, or what Ovid helps to see about Machiavelli, for me anyway, is that, right, like seduction for Ovid is never done. You always have to continue to seduce the person who you want to have attracted to you. You never finish the work. You always have to reinvent yourself. You always have to re-stimulate the connection. There's no finality to it. And that seems very similar to how Machiavelli thinks about politics. You know, there's no settled arrangement. There's no distribution of benefits. There's no way of managing the various pressures and potentialities of politics that once and for all secures your position, right? Or secures any particular arrangement. There's always the need for a kind of recalibration. And it doesn't seem to me to be consistent entirely with the description of chivalric literature, but maybe a variation on it, insofar as it's the same kind of model of interaction, but with more instability, a kind of more permanent instability inserted into it.
I was struck by your reference in the paper to Lucrezia's rather extreme statement of obedience to Callimaco, and wondered about the sincerity of it, given that she's now had the scales fall from her eyes and has been liberated and made independent in her own woman in a way. And it struck me that was jarring, and I wondered whether it wasn't, in fact, not to be taken as sincere, but a part of the propping up of male vanity that Ovid talks about when giving advice to women.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
That therefore, you know, she's appearing to make a judgment of his merit that is inflated, but it's exactly what he wants to hear, but serves her own ends at the same time. In other words, it's perhaps not really as subservient as she makes it sound.
Yeah, so one of the joys of writing the paper, we're putting in all kinds of like Easter egg sexual references, like happy ending and between the sheets and everything. I enjoyed myself in writing those. And I do feel like I could describe Lucrezia in that scene as topping from the bottom. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, right? Topping from the bottom. I think she's topping him from the bottom, meaning ostensibly she's in the more passive or receiving position, but she's playing it in a way that actually puts her effectively in charge. And, you know, I think that's a pretty astute insight into how lots of male-female relationships have gone over time. And certainly it's the essence of Ovid's advice about seduction, is to always seem as though you're the one being seduced as a woman.
Perhaps if you put in the explicit reference in the language used, the reviewers from political theory will be afraid to say it's not political enough.
Well, it is shocking to me that a paper about sex is not understood immediately to be political in character, right? I mean, we're rediscovering that, these days that sex is political, but I don't think that was any mystery, certainly to Florentines, and not to Romans either. And the play is just premised on the fact that public and private life are mutually constitutive, really. And but she's pumping him up. She wants him to feel like he's the man who he's in fact not going to be going forward, but needs to feel he is in order to be comfortable and reconciled with the situation.
Thank you.
Good. Quick, Jeff, how long do we typically go?
An hour and a half.
Okay, great.
If Michelle's
Just want to make sure. So Alex Duff has a question. Alex?
Hey, Michelle. Hey,
Should I
everyone.
shorten my answers though for time? I don't know what the queue looks like.
We got like
Two more.
four people in the queue.
Michelle, I really loved your paper. I share your feeling that the literature on Machiavelli could use a reconsideration of what it means when it says that there's a Lucretian dimension to Machiavelli. And I think that your paper goes a long way towards doing that. Just the detail and the granularity of the references that you dug up, I thought was fantastic. So I hope that makes it into the final draft, whatever that might be. I wonder if I could ask you to, I want to put this pretty simply. If Lucretia is educated over the plot of the play, is she educated by someone, or is she educated by a certain turn of events? And my impression is that you say that she, given the Lucretian backdrop to everything, that she discovers the Ovidian truth that loosening up a little bit and not being quite so tight is the secret to everyone being happy. There were no innuendos there, for the record. And where does she learn this? Is she instructed? I mean, Mansfield's argument, and he makes the case that if you look at Prince 18, all the stuff about handling and touching rather than seeing is how the prince manipulates appearances. And so maybe is Lucretia manipulating appearances? That's different than being satisfied by appearances. And I think that's a distinction worth. The prince, it doesn't seem to me, gets a lot of erotic satisfaction out of ruling. You could make an argument. So that's one. There was another way I wanted to frame it. Why don't I leave it at that? If it occurs to me in your response, I'll bring it up again. But yeah, who educates Lucretia, or does she educate herself?
I think I don't think there's an educator in the sense that sometimes the paper suggests in the parallel it tries to draw between Callimaco and Lucrezia and Epicurus and Lucretia. I think the parallel is sort of there in a loose, I mean, I think the line that we were just talking about, where Lucrezia says to Callimaco, "Oh, I take you for my lord and guide," right? I think it's very clearly an echo, but I don't think that necessarily means that Callimaco is coming to her as someone who's endowed with a kind of deeper understanding of the world that he's going to present to her, and she, right? I think it's more the experience of being raped, really, which I don't say clearly in the paper.
No, you don't.
No, but I think that's the appropriate description of what happens.
Yeah.
And that is the nail in the coffin of her belief that she can protect herself in and through the conventional virtues that she's tried to live her life by. They don't
That
work.
would tie it back into the Roman myth from the Lucretia, from the Lucretia connected to Lucretius, the philosopher. And it would show your acceptance of that strand of analysis, and you're adding this other ingredient.
Yeah, so the way I think about it, which doesn't come out in the paper, but I'm playing with bringing it out more for the sake of clarifying the point I want to make about the sort of virtue that she embodies at the end. It's that in ultimately being raped, right, with the complicity of everyone she knows and trusts in her life, she really understands that she needs to let go of the fantasy that by being a good person, she can make her way securely through the world. And she takes up an entirely different approach to how she interacts with the members of her family and her community, right? And it's one.
This is all a much more arresting claim than the already fascinating paper that you gave.
Right, but she's disabused. Okay, this is in part prompted, I should give credit to the first reviewer's report, stresses much more than my paper does, the importance of signaling that the initial figuration of Lucrezia as Roman Lucretia, it kind of goes hand in hand with her presentation as a kind of model of Christian virtue and someone who subscribes very deeply to sort of the Christian creed. And so, and at the end, I think in the paper, I take a misstep where I suggest that I think I need to rethink the claim that I make about her, that she herself embraces a life of pleasure. I'm not sure that that's the right description.
I thought your comments today and part of the paper were ambiguous on that. And I think that seems to me is a crucial point about how much of a prince she becomes.
Yeah, I think she's distanced from the kinds of pleasures that she's regulating. And I guess I'm not quite sure how to put that, but I'll figure it out. Without over.
I wanted to make a
Can
tiny
I say
little
one more
remark
thing on chapter 18, because you brought it up, where everyone sees who you are, but if you touch who you are, that discussion, but everyone touches Lucrezia. Right? So, and she shows that even when you're touched by lots of people, they cannot know who you are. It's a kind of radicalization of that idea that Machiavelli floats there of just how difficult it is to get underneath the surface of things, that you can be right up against the surface, flesh to flesh, and still not know what is just underneath your fingertips.
Yeah. I had no idea that Pliny the Elder had that thing to say about the mandrake root, that it's the herb of Circe. That's how, in the introduction to the history of political philosophy, Strauss talks about that being the first reference to nature. That's the herb that he says that Homer mentions nature once, and it's in this connection. That would be a cool thing to track down and think through. If you have any thoughts, I'd like to hear it later on. Well, thanks, Michelle. It's been just a wonderful paper to work through, and I'm pleased to hear your remarks today.
Yeah, thanks. No, and that's a part of the paper that I really enjoyed researching and writing about, just the contrast between the different pharmacological references being made there. I think it really helps.
I thought there were a number of references that I should not use my school computer to look up, and those footnotes were some of them.
Oh, the mandrake, the history of the mandrake. I mean, that's a real abbreviated. I mean, it used to be the case that, so in the Renaissance era, you would collect mandrakes from underneath, they were said to grow underneath the gallows. So hanged men would be left, with the noose around their neck, and their body would decompose, and the fluids from their body would fall to the soil and be absorbed, and out of it would grow these plants that then you would harvest and make into these love potions, because it was particularly their semen that I guess would be the first part to fall out of their body. And the root itself resembles, depending on how you look at it, either, there's sometimes it looks very much like a man, and sometimes it looks like a phallus. And in either case, it's I can't remember why it was criminal semen that was the most desirable for these purposes, but I have to.
This probably requires a longer footnote.
Yeah. Speaking of which, on the Circe, reminds me of really what you have in the play, it seems to me, Michelle, is a series of conversions.
Yeah.
Right. So you have Lucretia's converted, of course. I would argue Callimaco was converted to the form of his love, as I mentioned before. You're converted from the Lucretian to the Ovidian. Across the play, the audience is meant to be converted by it as well. And so, maybe in a way, it's not just manipulation, so the usual sort of Ligurio type political manipulation argument. It's actually something more than that goes across the play.
Yeah.
Agreed. Next question is from John.
Yeah, hello. Of course, thank you for the paper. I had never even thought that Lucrezia could be Lucretius, so that was great to be able to explore with you. So my question is about this little line that you bring up in the abstract and conclusion that Ligurio says about Lucrezia, that she is fit to govern a kingdom, right? And so you kind of throw this in there and you're like, hey, this is politics. I'm like, yeah, this is totally politics. And so I wonder how far this can be taken, right? Like how much of a connection can you draw to this and trying to build in like, oh, well, what does this say about leaders and how they're supposed to act, right? Of course, we have a character saying this, so it's difficult to parse out like, oh, like, is this actually what we want a leader to be? And I just wanted to know what you thought about that, and maybe this could be a direction that you could go for trying to connect it more to politics.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely. So that's the most explicit reference to politics in the play, clearly, right? And perhaps the most mysterious, in that no one quite knows what Ligurio means when he says that. And any number of attempts have been made to kind of nail the meaning down. And I think that's what I have in mind when I said earlier that I was thinking about how to like remain focused on virtue as the kind of key concept that I want to explore. There are others, adjacent connected political concepts that people have mentioned. But focusing particularly on the kind of virtue that she comes to possess and linking it to the prince, which is the clearest discussion of, although certainly not the only discussion of virtue that Machiavelli offers. But it's also the connection most invited by the line that you reference. And yeah, the readers of the paper for the journal were like, yeah, you mentioned politics in literally the last line of the paper one time. And like, could you say more? So that response you have is the response that they had as well. And I mean, I really like this kind of skepticism that you insert at the end of your, that's my kind of skepticism. It keeps me up at night and prevents me from coming to the conclusions that ultimately I do need to come to in order to finish a piece of writing. But I'm like, Ligurio says this. Is Ligurio's viewpoint really ultimately a trustworthy one? There's something very, dare I say, seductive about Ligurio. He's so capable, right? And he's so, he's one of these villainous figures, semi-villainous figures who you can't help but admire and in a way root for. But whenever you watch Breaking Bad or the TV shows that play with the same kind of persona, you always have to be on guard that you're not being brought into supporting someone who really ultimately is going to reveal themselves as being flawed. And I think there's a real way in which he gets usurped in the play. He's initially the instigator and the puppeteer, right? And John brought this to my attention last night too. I mean, he's the one who sets the whole thing in motion when he has this conversation with Calimico in which he relays how amazing Lucrezia is and tempts him into seeing her for himself, right? And which is again a kind of, he presents to Calimico an image of her, and then he pursues that image, and out of that come all the fantasies then he comes to hold about her, not really knowing her at all, as we've all done at some point in our romantic lives, I'm sure. But then by the end, I mean, I just don't know. I just don't know. And this goes back to Bob's first comment, right? And question. I don't know if at the end he's sort of proven to be the manager in chief that he seems initially to be. I mean, I really think she outclasses him ultimately. She's slow out of the gate, but he takes up a position in her household, at her table, at her invitation, right? And that's not a defeat exactly. He wants that food, but it's maybe not where we would expect him to end up. And there are other ways of reading the play where there's more going on, perhaps. But yeah. So yeah, does that answer your question somewhat?
Yeah, it does. And it also, I mean, it makes me also think about how Plowtine, like Lucrezia is as a character. She's maybe like like the clever slave kind of character, where she kind of ends up controlling everything that's happening, even though she's like the least powerful character in the play, right? And that's just another little nugget I wanted to.
I mean, I really think, going back to what John was saying about conversion being such an important element, it doesn't have the static character that any number of other plays that use similar plot devices have, which is all the characters are, there's the dumb so-and-so, there's the wily so-and-so, and they remain that through the whole play. It's just through the interaction of those personalities that you get the drama. Here, there's a kind of added and much deeper dramatic element where people really aren't who they were when the play started. And that's as crucial for the story as anything else, if not more so.
Then it would seem that if you could connect, like you could be, at the end, like this little premonition that she's fit to govern a kingdom is made, and then she actually becomes it, could be something like, and then if you wanted to actually try to make the connection and say that it is real, that might be a way you could do it.
But Ligurio wouldn't know that.
That she's fit?
If she becomes fit at the end and he says it earlier, then that problematizes and keeps you up at night.
Yeah, but why does he say that so early in the play? It's such a strange offhand comment for him to make on the basis of her just being a difficult person.
Yeah, I've also, when I taught this before, I've said, not on that part, but there's a sort of tragic movement in the play that makes it, like you said, not static. I mean, after all, they were going to kill the guy, so there's kind of a danger haunting this play the whole way as well.
Yeah.
That makes it not Plowtine, for example. Aline has a question.
Yes, good to see you, Michelle. And I have to start by apologizing for coming late to the conversation. I was in another Zoom meeting, and with all the time zones, I got confused about the timing. So I might miss some, so my questions might be redundant. Maybe you have already answered them. I will try to kind of like go after what Alex and John asked you, and your answer clarified some of my previous question. But I still have like one, maybe it was asked before I joined. You say Lucrezia is a feminized version of Lucretius. And she cannot be the Lucretia from the Sabines because she kept her morals unlike the new Lucrezia. But Lucretius is more like Lucretia, not like the new Lucrezia, because he's also against the, how you call them, and value of sex, it's an empty desire, and so on and so forth. So he's the family man, etc., etc. So I don't see how this argument stands if you consider that. I mean, you can make the argument, but you cannot use, she is Lucretius because Lucrezia, she cannot be Lucretia because Lucretia was a woman with high morals and a family woman and whatnot. But Lucretius is the same.
Yes.
So that's one question. And the last one, which I think everyone kind of talked about it one way or another, about the political part. Like, I like the topping from the bottom part, like you just said. But the question, let me rephrase probably Alex's question. So who is in control of the images, since images are so important? So it's not about sexual pleasure, or it's about the fantasies. So it's about controlling the images. So why is Lucrezia the one that is fit for a kingdom? Is she in control of the images? I don't think so. So who is actually in control of the imaging, if any? Or if there's no one in control of the images, and maybe Lucrezia was deceived but then she came up, as you said, popping from the bottom, and basically she got wiser than everyone else. After being the victim, she becomes the controller.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what to make out of this.
Right. So on the first point, I mean, it is just complicated in a way that can be very frustrating to try to render in prose, right? Like what I'm, the layered character of the allusions in this play. And so ultimately the claim that I want to make is that the references to Lucretius are very there and have meaning, but they're a kind of feint that is parallel to the kind of parodic references to Lucretius that one finds in Ovid, and that ultimately Machiavelli is more interested in Ovid's account of how one should relate oneself to the world of fantasy. He's more interested, more invested in Ovid's answer to that question than he is Lucretius's. But like Ovid, he's going to tell a story about how one should engage with these things that leverages and in many ways makes fun of the itself very fantastical idea that one gets in Lucretius, that you can just get rid of them. You can just inoculate yourself against false perceptions, against illusions. If you're just rigorous enough in your thinking, if you're just, withholding enough in your, willingness to accept beliefs as they come to you, you can expunge these things wholly and live a life of, philosophic clarity and certainty.
So wait, if I may interrupt here. So what are you saying is that as a matter of fact, Lucrezia is more like Lucretius because she also thinks, like you explain it later, that she is somehow detached and she's in control of the images, or she is so naive as Lucretius is naive, that you can get rid and be aware of all the fantasies that you are subjected to,
Mm-hmm.
or not, because
Yeah.
I'm still confused here.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a neat like a almost a mathematical formula whereby certain things are equivalent to other things. I think he's playing just in a somewhat looser way with a literary style that he finds in Ovid, whereby Lucretius and what Lucretius stands for is, in part accepted, but in part rejected, right? And there's a kind of ambivalence in Ovid toward Epicureanism, an ambivalence that's can be summarized as a real, a very friendly posture toward the emphasis on pleasure and pleasure seeking that one gets in Epicureanism, while also being, not having a lot of patience for or interest in the idea that pleasure seeking has to be, or the life of pleasure is one divorced from the life of fantasy, right? And so that's Ovid's view of Lucretius. And then as a reader of both of them, right, Machiavelli's transcribes Lucretius. He also hangs out with, reads intensely Ovid during his exile. And my inference is that as he's reading Ovid, he understands completely what all these various like forms of wordplay and illusion are within Ovid, that are jabs ultimately at Lucretius and Lucretius's own uptight sort of posture toward, or his intellectualism, I guess.
So Lucrezia, it's more like Lucretius in the beginning, but then she becomes more like Ovid.
Lucrezia is Ovid in drag. And the drag is Lucretius. Does that?
It gets a little bit too complicated.
I know, and I only made those
Streamline-
words. I think I'm right. I just don't feel like, I feel like I'm trying to like fit into like a, I don't know, like a FedEx box or something.
Well, nice try anyway.
I'm going to write drag, another reference.
Yeah, if you can get RuPaul in there, then I'd be really impressed. We have about 5 minutes and one more question. Emma.
Oh, great. This is related. I also really love the, I'm convinced by your textual work. So I think that I also hope that that stays in. And I also really like, given the sort of, I don't want to call it a fad, the current like desire on the part of scholars to establish everyone's Lucretianism or Epicureanism. I really like that Machiavelli's Lucretianism is actually just a kind of satirical move. So, so I think that's also very like fun and useful. But so the thing about which I'm persuaded to, and maybe this is, you can tell me if this is what the reviewers at the journal thought too. So the leap that needs to be made for me, I think, is that I'm also convinced that Machiavelli is using, is sort of like in agreement with Ovid in critiquing Lucretius, and you sort of do the careful textual work of tracking how there's allusions to both Lucretius and also the sort of Ovidian critique of Lucretius. But what I'm less convinced by at the end of the paper is like whether or not there's some established value in Machiavelli's view of like being an Ovidian. So I don't have a clear picture at the end of the paper really of, and this isn't a critique of your work because it's not clear to me that that has to be done except perhaps for the purposes of establishing the political point. But like, I'm not quite clear like what the stakes are in what it means to be an Ovidian as a sort of like positive statement or like move out of simply being an Ovidian in the sense of critiquing Lucretius, if that makes sense. So I think you want to make that leap at the end into establishing what it would mean then for Machiavelli to embrace Ovid over Lucretius. But I think in the play, the way that you've set it up, the embrace is mostly an embrace of the mode in which Ovid is himself already a critic. So I just wonder if you have an idea of like what does it mean to be an Ovidian for Machiavelli?
Yeah, I mean, at the heart, I think of Ovid's critique of Lucretius is a critique of the kind of ethic of abstinence that Lucretius counsels. So that, the idea that one ought to commit oneself to satisfying one's desires, but only the right ones and only the right way, right? And, on the one hand, observing that so much of who we are and what we become entangled with goes beyond those appetites and their proper satisfaction. On the one hand, Lucretius is continually recognizing that as a fundamental element of human life, right? We're continually, it seems, riding the waves of erotic desire. He doesn't give us many examples of people who have freed themselves completely from it, right? Like, the Epicurean sage, I guess. But who were they? But, he's so astute, and there's so much richness in his description of human life as it's lived by most of us. And yet the counsel he gives is to withdraw, right? And that's at the heart of the Epicurean ethic writ large, withdraw. And it's just not tenable. I think Machiavelli, this is his realism. It's not tenable. You can't withdraw from the world. You can't withdraw from politics. You can't withdraw from being a human. If that's what being a human entails, is to be, only in touch with the world through these things, right? And if always and everywhere, people have been powerfully moved by erotic desire among many other forms of desire, then that just is what it is. And you have to find a way of negotiating that world, not removing oneself from it, right? Not trying to live, on high, as he says at one point, right? High up on the cliffs, watching other people struggle below. That's just not, I think from Machiavelli's point of view, consistent with Ovid. That's just not realistic. And that's what Lucrezia comes to recognize. She can't abstain from all this stuff that swirls around her. She's going to have to go into it, into the thick of it, right into the center of it. And she's going to have to cut her way through it. And that means engaging. And so that's what she learns, in a sense, to do. There's like a simple story about that to be told in any number of contexts about people have to just learn to, make their way through the world or whatever. But there's a more sophisticated version too, which has to do with just what that looks like when you're dealing with this particular dimension of human experience, which does have fantasy at its core by both accounts, right? Ovid is just as circumspect, I think, as Lucretius about whether there's any reality underneath the experience of being seduced by something. And so I guess the upshot or the payoff to being Lucrezia at the end, or being persuaded to be Lucrezia's ourselves as audience members, to be converted with her, is that we too will maybe finally relinquish this kind of dying hope we have that if we just try harder and to live by the virtues of abstinence, which is what I think he believes many or most of the Christian virtues to be, that we can win our own salvation from that world of depravity, and that rather we've got to, we got to dive in. And in doing so, we'll be better off. And, I hesitate a lot now using the language of like happiness, right? Like, I'm not sure she's that happy at the end. She doesn't seem that happy, right? And maybe there's a kind of pleasure to be had in bossing people around that is consistent with the nature she's had right from the very beginning of the play, but it's probably more accurate or kind of insightful with regard to what Machiavelli is trying to communicate, that she has a say in what kind of life she's going to have. And it's not, like, there's a lot to not like, even I think from her own point of view about the ultimate outcome, but she, doesn't just have a say, but, I don't know if there was a question earlier that I didn't answer about like who's ultimately into control. I wouldn't go so far as to say, everything is by her design and her design alone. I think that would also be a kind of fantasy that Machiavelli doesn't want us to subscribe to, that we can conquer fortune so completely that we never have to do battle with her again, or that the world is entirely a product of our own ambition, as executed perfectly by us again and again and again without resistance, right? We're always dealing with the world as we find it. And so is she. So it's imperfect and kind of incomplete, but better. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Jeff, any closing words of warning, predictions about the next year, anything else?
Well, this has been great. Thanks, Michelle, for doing this, and thanks everybody else for coming. I mean, if people want to continue, let's continue. We can start up September 1st or first Friday in September. If everyone wants to do it, I'd be happy to continue through next year.
Great. Well, thanks again for doing it.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle.